All right. Hello. Welcome back to episode 2, the second episode of the Untrodden podcast. This time I'm joined with Matthew McManus. Um, and yeah, he's a academic. He's published books about his main claim to the fame. The main thing you should know about him is that he's interested in liberalism and socialism, especially combining the two. And he's also written about like the right wing, sort of bridging like academic political theory with contemporary politics, trying to understand what is the right, and also his particular brand of being on the left. So I really want to ask him about how he is on the left, what kind of person he is on the left, how he compares with other people on the left, and also a bit about the right also as well here. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is, so you mentioned in your book that that you think there's a lot of value to Marx, of course, especially his understanding of power and just generally his critique of capitalism and the global impacts of capitalism and that sort of thing. But what I really wanted to ask you about is, it seems to me that one of the most maybe misunderstood and also crucial like subjects for understanding what kind of a Marxist you are is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And so you can understand this a few different ways. I think the most important thing to understand is that it's counter to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, right? It's in the context of saying liberalism is already a kind of dictatorship, not a dictatorship in the sense of one man, but a dictatorship in the sense that a class dominates. And what Marx wants is a replacement of that. And I think a lot of Marxists, especially orthodox Marxists, what they end up saying is that there's a complete distinction between a kind of society and state that will exist in this form and what exists now. It's a complete, a revolution in every sense of the word, socially, politically, whatever. And it seems like you're not interested in, or I'm curious, do you object to this idea? Do you completely reject the idea that there's going to be a complete distinction between the two? Do you think that it's impossible to distinguish between the two as two completely different realities, or how much of a Marxist are you on that specific point there?
Well, on that specific point, I would say that I'm quite Marxist, but not a Marxist-Leninist, and this is the reason why, right? Certainly, if you read the Communist Manifesto and a lot of the kind of descendant pieces that are associated with that, there's an implication that a kind of millenarian break might occur in the event of a proletariat revolution, and everything will be changed. The way that somebody like Edmund Burke, for example, worried that everything would be changed. But I think that if you read the critique of the Gotha program and some of Marx's later works, it becomes very, very clear that he rejects the idea that some kind of millenarian break is going to occur with bourgeois society, and even castigates the idea of that as ahistorical and utopian. He points out in the critique of the Gotha program that the reality is that if you're a historicist and materialist, any kind of revolution that takes place is going to produce a society that is, to use his terminology, stamped by many features of the old society. And that's, of course, going to include socialism, which is going to retain many forms of bourgeois right or bourgeois recht into the future. He's a little ambiguous about what this means in the critique of the Gotha program, but certainly he thinks that bourgeois norms about labor and the value of labor, for example, are going to persist. Certain kinds of bourgeois laws and institutions are going to persist. And it's only going to be after we develop the means of production to such a high level that communism, wherein the state may or may not wither away, becomes possible, and we ascribe upon our banners the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So I think that Marx's own point on this, certainly in his mature period, is very, very clear, right? This idea that you're going to have some kind of year one style revolution is a utopian fantasy that has no place in serious materialist analysis. I think that the reason it is perennially appealing is that there's a kind of radical aesthetic to millenarianism. There's always been appealing to people who think that society as it exists is fundamentally broken. And there's something exciting about this idea of beginning again, right? And I can find that appealing myself as well. I often quote Thomas Paine's dictum that we have it in our power to begin the world anew, which is, a classic revolutionary statement. But in our more sensible moments, I think we have to realize that that just ain't going to happen.
Right. Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because the first person I had on here was Chris Catrone, and I don't know how familiar you are with him, but the reason I think it's interesting is because he would absolutely agree with you that it's like a fantasy to expect that society is just going to magically change overnight. He agrees with all of that, right? He's very strong on that. But the difference is that for him, still, there's something like ontologically, I would say, like different about the next world, I guess. And so there's something that leads him to, and I think this really elucidates the difference between you and other leftists, even the ones who aren't that radical revolutionary type, because they truly believe that there's something completely inherently different in its DNA when the proletariat is running the state. Whereas no matter what we do, no matter how we reform it, all the things that you would say are good steps, when you say liberal democracy is a good step, we want welfare because it means that more people will flourish. Maybe you have a very basic philosophical point to say that's a good thing. Whereas they would say, I don't care about any of that. I don't care. I don't care how many welfare programs we pass. I don't care how many wars we get into. I don't care if Donald Trump wins the election. We don't care about any of that because ultimately, ontologically, the capitalist state is this, and we want a completely different kind of state. And so they really distinguish between these things, and it seems like you're not doing that. And so even if they're not doing that kind of like childish fantasy you bring up, how do you respond to people who see it that way?
Well, I suppose that there are two things I could say about that. The first one is, of course, the idea that liberalism or capitalism are just efficient modes of production that need to be completely smashed is again antithetical to even orthodox Marxism, even the most revolutionary forms of orthodox Marxism as articulated in something like the Communist Manifesto, right? The Communist Manifesto opens by applauding the bourgeoisie and applauding capitalism as without a doubt the most progressive mode of production to have ever emerged. Marx and Engels are almost too hagiographic, I would say, in applauding how all the illusions of feudal society are being stripped away along with its traditions, hierarchies, kind of obstinate forms of mysticism, whatever you want to call it. Now, they're very clear, of course, that what is replacing feudal society is not good enough. And I think that any leftist has to agree with Marx and Engels' assessment in the Communist Manifesto. But I think that we need to be dialectical in our appreciation of the achievements of bourgeois society, even if, unlike me, you don't want to be a liberal socialist. At least if you want to be a Marxist. The second thing that I want to say that's perhaps more important is this actually relates back to some of the questions that you want to ask about the political right. I think that in many cases, the difference between liberalism and socialism are real, right? There's no denying that, and I'll get into that if you wish. But the differences are more narrow than one might expect if you take a more expansive view of what is politically possible. So I've spent a lot of time reading thinkers on the right, from the most vulgar like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson to much more impressive figures like Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, etc. And a recurring theme in right-wing thought, going at least back to Nietzsche, probably goes back even further than that, really, is that actually, or Dostoevsky for that matter, liberalism and socialism are very similar from this right wing perspective. They are both humanist Enlightenment doctrines committed to liberty for all, equality for all, and solidarity for all. They just understand how to achieve that in somewhat different ways. And that's a through line that continues to this day in the thinking of various figures ranging from Age Emile to Sam Francis, you name it. Now, there's a vulgar expression of this, which you find in Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, which is just, anything to the left of Ronald Reagan is liberalism, socialism, cultural Marxism. I want to have none of it. And I'm not engaging in that at all. But more serious thinkers like Heidegger really are onto something when they point out that, as you put it, liberalism and socialism or capitalism and communism are metaphysically the same. They draw very heavily on these humanistic, scientific worldviews. And again, they both understand the overall ideal society in more or less the same way, one where people flourish and are able to develop their human capacities in order to pursue their projects more effectively. So, spending a lot of time with the right, I did become convinced that they are absolutely correct, that there is this deep affinity between liberalism and socialism, both historically, normatively, and metaphysically. You can even go further back if you want with Nietzsche and talk about it at a theological level, right? The difference is, of course, that I think that this affinity should be celebrated and the connection between the two should be drawn out rather than rejecting them wholesale the way that figures on the right do.
Right. Yeah. Going into more of what you're talking about right now about the right, it seems to me that it's actually very difficult to say, and perhaps this is why it was such a struggle for such a long time. It seems that it is actually difficult to say that we're all equal. It is actually fairly difficult to say that. It seems intuitive, and it's very much intuitive to me, But at the same time, when I really think about it, and I think about my elitist tendencies, right? If I think about the fact that I genuinely believe that it's just a fact that some people are just going to be dumber than others, right? And that's because of a whole host of factors. I don't think it's like genes. I think it's like society. And so eventually, I think you're going to have a certain segment of society that's just going to be less educated. And so, how can we really ground the idea that these people are not like less fit to govern in some way? Because it seems like any system that we're making, even if it is liberal socialist, we're ultimately elevating certain kinds of people who are more able, right? And we're ultimately going to have certain classes of society that are lower and they just sort of exist. And it doesn't. We might want to educate more people and broaden, the able population, and we don't want to like restrict people or oppress people like the right may want to. But it seems like ultimately we have to accept some level of inequality in terms of what exists. And so, yeah, how do we deal with that, and how do we um, deal with that contradiction in the fact that we are elevating certain kinds of people?
Sure. Well, this is historically and analytically quite complex point. So I'll try to break it up into segments. So the first thing to point out is that historically the through line, certainly in Western thought, has been that fundamentally people are not equal, either normatively, spiritually, or physically. For that reason, clearly men are superior to women. Certain kinds of men should be elevated over others. And of course, there are variations of this kind of discourse that persist and can be very convincing and plausible to this day. Good example of this would be Aristotle, right? Enormously important thinker of antiquity, great philosopher. There's no denying it, right? And as Leo Strauss points out in The City of Man, Leo Strauss being the important conservative classical scholar. He's a lot more than that, but let's just go with that for now. In The City of Man, he says, look, for Aristotle, it was just common sense, and other thinkers like Aristotle, that certain kinds of people were better than others and deserved to be elevated over others. If you'd come forward with any of this malarkey about all men being created equal or being entitled to equal participation, they would think that at best this was a kind of strange notion, and at worst that you were a dangerous reformer who was going to bring about the worst possible kind of society, namely demagoguery. Now, when this argument for moral and political equality began, that's hugely debated by historians. Some people, like Jack Donnelly or Amartya Sen, trace it back to the Buddhist tradition, uh, particularly figures like the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka. Martha Nussbaum traces it back to Stoic thought, particularly the thinking of Seneca, where he argued that fundamentally, the Roman emperor and the slave are both the same kind of being. They're going to live out their lifestyle or their life, and then they're going to die. And it doesn't matter whether you're emperor or slave. That's the same fate that awaits all of us. And so we should demonstrate compassion for the highest and least among us, of course. Nietzsche, of course, attributed it in large strokes to Christianity, arguing that this is where this idea, not only that people are equal, comes from, certainly in the eyes of God, but that actually the meek and the poor and the destitute, the wretched of the earth, as the Gospels put it, are those that will one day inherit the world. Because if they're not the most beloved of God, certainly the ones whose needs God's prioritize. And this is all an awful lot of variation, right? I argue in my pieces that the modern notion of equality really got kickstarted in the early liberal tradition, which is the beginning of the more substantive answer to your question. And early liberal thinkers gave a lot of different variations of the argument that people are equal. I'll just give two, and then you can feel free to respond, and we can carry on a conversation if you want. So Hobbes, very important proto-materialist thinker, maybe even just straight up materialist thinker, actually argues that by and large, people are fundamentally materially equal. So you talked about, how some people are physically a little bit better, stronger than others, or mentally a little bit stronger than others. Hobbes says he's just not very fundamentally impressed by that. He says, yeah, there are some human beings that are a little stronger than others, a little more fit than others. But go compare any human being to an elephant or a tiger, and we come up looking remarkably short, right? Get over yourself is kind of the idea. Or even think cognitively. Yeah, there are some people who are definitely smarter than others, and there are definitely people who have aptitudes that others don't. I'm not particularly good with computers. I call my sister up and ask her to help me on that because she's a computer engineer. But he says, think about, the difference between a very dumb person and a very smart person, and then imagine the vast richness of what it's possible to know. And the reality is that the average person looks pretty stupid, and the smartest person also looks pretty stupid, right? In terms of what is possible for them to know. And in fact, he says the fact that some people commend themselves for being smarter than others, and this is a really witty part of Leviathan, just goes to demonstrate how similar we all are, really. Because each person, as he puts it, imagines himself or herself to have a little bit more wisdom and a little bit more savvy than the person next to him, which just goes to show how alike we all really are in the end. So again, the kind of message is get over yourself, right? You're a naked ape. You might be a little smarter than the next guy, but for the most part, you're going to live out your 80 years and then die, like every other naked ape out there, if you're lucky, right? You might also be subject to a violent death before that, no matter how savvy you are. So that's a kind of materialist argument, as he understands it, kind of proto-scientific, for a kind of equality. A much more attractive kind of equality is that put forward by John Locke, right? Which has roots again in a kind of Christian religious outlook, but it's kind of modernized by Locke saying fundamentally, in the state of nature, all people are equal and possess natural rights. Whether that's because of God or because of reason or some combination of the two, it's widely debated in Lockean scholarship. But obviously, there are a lot of problems with this idea of natural rights. I don't personally believe in the idea of certainly God-given natural rights. And I definitely wouldn't agree with the set of rights that Locke argues are important. But nonetheless, there's no denying this has had a huge influence on revolutionary and leftist movements going forward, from the American Revolution, of course, the French Revolution, uh, even the February Revolution in Russia. So that's a different kind of way of arguing for equality, and then many more are going to emerge after that we can talk about as well. But I think fundamentally the argument for equality that I would put forward would be somewhat different than what you find Hobbes or Locke putting forward.
Right. I mean, what I'm really interested in is like I agree with all of that. I think all of that makes sense, but I also think that um, it's kind of hard to untangle different contributing factors here, right? So I think Aristotle and all of his thinkers at the time were completely right to say women aren't capable, right? That was right. That was all correct because that women were not. The society wasn't built in a way that women would be capable, right? It was you had certain expectations, certain things that you were allowed to do, certain social influences, all sorts of things that contributed to women generally being a certain thing. But then what we realized was, if we change those, if we broadened like the scope of things that are accepted of women, if we raise women differently, if society encourages different behaviors, that can make a huge, gigantic difference. But maybe in the first place, you have to have a philosopher to say, maybe we're not that different from women. Maybe you have to have a philosopher to say that, and then we start to see the practical effects of that, which is that society reorganizes itself, and then we start to see, yeah, women are pretty similar to us. But my question is, do you think the way that you understand equality, do you think it will eventually lead to a different, I guess, I suppose this is part of liberal socialism, but do you think it's guaranteed to lead to a different world where there isn't so much of a distinction between groups of people? Because it seems to me that like right now we have I agree with you that relative to animals, or relative to, I mean, a lot of these arguments were equal, but it seems like no one can really get away from the fact. I mean, even Lenin can't get away from the fact. All sorts of different people can't get away from the fact that certain people are more capable. That's just what we see, and there's going to be a class of people who's ruling the state and a class of people who's just sort of living day by day. Do you think your philosophy is going to lead to a different reality and how many of those people exist and how those classes exist? Are you going to change reality in that way, or is it okay that these differences exist? Or I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, I don't think I'm going to change reality myself, right? I'm just one person, and I've got my own issues to deal with. Let's just put it that way, right? I would hope that political movements, if they were to find what I was arguing for attractive, in cooperation, would democratically reform society in certain kinds of important ways. But I think here an important point is to talk about difference as association with equality. So for a long time, it was actually the right that monopolized a lot of the rhetoric of difference and differentiation. The modern left's kind of assimilation of that rhetoric, arguing for difference, schizoanalysis, that kind of thing, is just that. It's a much more modern development. And I think it's important here to understand how the right understands difference. The right has long charged that what the left wants to do is enact this kind of leveling project of reducing everyone to the same kind of person. And the reason that they charge this is, of course, that the left has fundamentally been committed to destroying a lot of the social hierarchies that they take to be essential to differentiating people. You know, gender hierarchies, racial hierarchies, aristocratic hierarchies, class hierarchies, all of which the right thinks are not only essential to ordering society appropriately, but to they add color and variation to a society. You know, they're pleasing illusions, as Burke once put them in the Reflections on the Revolution in France. And you know, this is a charge that persists to this day. Samuel Francis in Beautiful Losers. Some people might know that Samuel Francis is one of the most important white nationalist thinkers and a hideous racist. Let's be very clear about that. He charges that the left wants a kind of dull, gray uniformity spread across the world through this kind of cosmopolitan universalist ideology, and they want everyone to be the same. Alain de Benoit, another important hard right thinker, makes exactly the same charge, where he argues that fundamentally this attack on inequality is a demand for uniformity, right? An erasure of at least hierarchical differences. And I think that this charge, by the way, is a ridiculous one. Now, there's no doubt that the left has wanted to challenge hierarchies of domination, but very often, if you look just beneath the surface, it's precisely because the left wants to allow the expression of a different kind of difference, to coin a phrase. If the right's understanding of difference is pyramidal, right? There's rankings on the pyramid with some people, very few at the top, and a lot of people at the bottom. The left has a mosaic-like understanding of what difference should look like, where each person or each group will be different and equal, but it will contribute to the mosaic and beatify society through the variation that one sees internal to it. And you know, a good example of this that I saw just today is there was a debate between an LGBTQ activist and a MAGA personality, with the MAGA personality arguing that they wanted that the left wants to destroy uh, gender differences to make all individuals the same. These kinds of androgynous type of beings. And, you know, the LGBTQ activists quite rightly said, actually, I think that we're standing up for a very important kind of individual expression, namely the kind of the individual expression that allows you to love who you care about and to reflect that love in your being and your way of interacting with one another. And I think that the reality is that this egalitarian understanding of difference as a kind of mosaic is a much more sincere and much more encompassing appreciation of difference than the often quite bizarre pyramidal ideals of difference that are propagated by right-wing thinkers. Uh, Certainly, I think if you were to ask most women, most slaves, and most subordinates through history whether they thought that the variation in society brought about by aristocracy or plantocracy was a good one, they would tell you to get the hell out, and rightly so.
Yeah, so one of a little bit more on that. So I was also I've spent some time learning about early Christianity and different ideas and how diverse it was at the time. And one of the things that was branded a heresy was Pelagianism, right? Which is obviously very simply it's this idea. It's very much focusing on free will. Pelagius was very much into the idea of maybe you should be a good person of your own free will, and that's ultimately what matters is free will. And that was branded a heresy because there needed to be divine grace. God needed to have a direct hand in the world, and to deny that and put everything in the hands of each other was heretical. So, do you think that there's something necessary for the right politically to instate this metaphysical divine hand in order to justify their claims? Do you think Pelagianism was it? By putting everything up to free will, it was essentially opening up like an enlightenment box in a way, very primitively, very, very, very early stages. And so the reason that it was deemed a heresy, sort of politically, it's justified by the state of affairs at the time and the kind of state that they desired, the Roman state, the theologians, whatever it was, they needed this metaphysical justification. Do you think that's an important piece of the right? Is that justification?
Well, I think that here we have to be cautious, right? Because notions of freedom and free will have been appealed to across the political spectrum. Now, some people have tried to ascribe either deterministic or liberatory aspirations to the right as a whole, or metaphysical commitments to the right as a whole. Ted Hondrick comes to mind immediately in his book Conservatism, where he argues that the right is fixated on this idea of free will because it wants to deny any form of social determinism. I think that's simply a mistake, right? Again, usually on the right, you'll see appeals to strong notions of free will when it comes to defending things like personal moral responsibility, or when it's defending things like the importance of being criminally liable for wrongs that you might do for another person to another person, right? And then their attitude is usually uh, lock them up and throw away the key. If it's not, fry them up as quickly as possible, right? But the right is very, very prone to ascribing immutable characteristics to society, which clearly are not immutable, and insisting that we have no choice but to defer to them, and argues that any effort to deploy human agency in order to transform society is either unnatural or a violation of God's providence, or even impossible, right? Simply contrary to the laws of nature. And there you'll see them become pretty strict determinists, right? Uh, when people argue, well, if you believe that agency and freedom are so important, why is it that trans individuals shouldn't be allowed to express their gender identity in public and have that be respected? And people immediately fire back, well, no, that's a violation of the law of nature, the laws of science. Your identity is determined by your sex at birth, and no amount of agent fuel agency directed towards changing that can actually do a damn thing about it, right? Similarly, people on the right our left have always deployed a certain kind of liberatory language, right? Even think about the rhetoric of rights, right? The idea of liberty for all, equality for all, solidarity for all, really leans pretty strongly in the direction of suggesting that freedom is very important as a left-wing value. And of course, Marx and Engels were very similar, right? They constantly stressed the importance of a new kind of emancipation that would emerge with the transition to a socialist society. As late as Capital Volume 3, you still see some of this humanist language in Marx, where he says, in the communist society to become the development of human powers will be an end in and of itself, rather than simply a means to maximizing capital outputs. And this, of course, will be liberatory, right? Because through developing people's human capacities as an end in itself, will enable them to become more free. Although, of course, in such a way that the free development of me will be a condition and even a catalyst for the free development of yourself, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, the left is also quite happy to appeal to notions of social determinism and other kinds of determinism, where that seems rhetorically and even metaphysically necessary, right? Think again about crime, right? It's very often the case that leftists will be much more sympathetic to arguing that there are social causalities underpinning criminalization, which means that, of course, it is not the fault of whoever we label a criminal that they rob or steal or murder or whatever it happens to be, and consequently that we should treat them with compassion rather than with disdain. Or, another good example of that would, of course, be arguments about things, excuse me, like poverty, right? Many leftists would argue that poverty is not the responsibility of the poor, and I think rightly so, because there are social and natural causalities that contribute to poverty, and consequently this moralization that the right loves to indulge in when it comes to the poor. I saw Matt Walsh, the conservative commentator, doing that just the other day when he was lampooning and sneering at the homeless, saying that they stink and that they use drugs and they kind of deserve to be where they are. Well, then every leftist gets up in arms about that, saying, no, it's not really their fault or responsibility. So I don't think that either the right or the left has a monopoly on the language of free will or determinism. I think that as political ideologies, people tend to mix and match those sentiments. Where it is in line with their normative outlooks. Although, of course, the greatest thinkers on the right and left will try to be more consistent on that point, on these points.
Right. Yeah, one more. I want to ask a little bit more about um, sort of the contradiction of democracy and figuring out how we can actually make democracy real and practical. And I want to quote actually directly from your Marx chapter on page
Sure.
135 here, and where basically you say,
Sorry, this is the Liberal Socialism book, right?
yeah, yeah,
Okay, cool. I just have a few Marx chapters and
that's
different
fair.
things.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
that's
like,
fair.
fucking,
Um, so basically, you're describing Marx's objections to liberalism, and you say that many of his objections apply to the profoundly imperfect liberal democracy of the 21st century. And you also say that many of his objections certainly apply to the 19th century's democracies. And so there's sort of a historical appreciation of the varieties of liberalism that have existed. And then you also, finally, direct quote here, say that this support for a highly democratic and accountable political system characterized by minimal domination is praiseworthy, but it largely sidesteps correct liberal worries about the need to divide power between different bodies to avoid its concentration to a few hands. And so obviously you're talking about the French Civil War, the Paris Commune, and how
Mhm.
Marx was very friendly towards the idea of this direct democracy, this quickly, we can recall our representatives quickly, and there's a direct democratic engagement in the Paris Commune. And you're saying that this is naive and that liberals are correct in saying, in sort of like the founding fathers' method of we need to have different bodies of power, we need to divide these, we need to constrain these, we need to have a system that protects these things. Because just saying we're going to have direct democracy and that's going to be great because people can directly participate, that's not going to actually, in reality, lead to good outcomes. Um, so I want to ask you about this because this is really difficult. I mean, this is a really difficult question to figure out. If we're liberals and we say that democracy is one of the highest values that we're aspiring towards, and then we say, but we can't have complete democracy because we know that's not going to work. How do we draw, like, where do we draw the line on that? How do we know that we're not just, again, bringing back to my earlier point, how do we know that we're not just maintaining a ruling class essentially by creating systems, and but at the same time we want to have good outcomes, and so we might need to make certain choices simply because they have better outcomes. How do we, yeah, like what are we doing here? What are we, how do we know we're
Well,
making a good choice? Yeah.
sure. Well, look, I just want to be very clear. Like a lot of leftists, I have an instinctive sympathy for more democracy. And indeed, I've argued in many cases that we need more democracy, certainly in the economy, and
Right.
I'd stand by that. And that's a kind of Marxist impulse that I have as well. However, I think that the great left liberal Ronald Dworkin makes a very sharp point in his book, Is Democracy Here?, where he points out that direct democracy doesn't necessarily have to lead to left outcomes. It's very easy to imagine a scenario where 51% of the population could vote to subordinate or enslave the other 49%, and then say, well, democracy rules. And what you have is the creation of essentially an apartheid looking society. And of course, there are plenty of instances where things that aren't exactly like that occurred, but look very much like that have occurred, right? Or again, think about the example of direct democracy that we have on record, ancient Athens, right? Only 10% of the population was actually able to meaningfully participate in politics at best, right? That was a high number, and most of the people who did the actual work in society were slaves or women or non-citizens. Which is one of the reasons Marx himself pointed out that Aristotle and other Greek thinkers just weren't really able to understand the mode of production on which their political forms were dependent, because the work was just invisible to them, since they were able to participate in politics and social life, whereas so many others were denied that kind of opportunity. What Dworkin points out is that a more rich understanding of democracy isn't just as a pure procedural mechanism where we say, well, 51% of the population wants this, so they should get it, even if that means subordinating the other 49%. Instead, a richer conception of democracy involves recognizing that what we need to do is treat people as equals, right? Which includes taking very seriously their fundamental rights to be protected against various kinds of, especially conservative majoritarian impulses where necessary, right? If you want a good example of this that he refers to consistently, if you were to institute direct democracy in the American South in the 1950s, and say that this is the mechanism that we're going to use in order to adjudicate decisions, what you would have had was almost certainly going to be one of the most extraordinarily reactionary and racist regimes that would have emerged in human history, right? And it's very unlikely you would have seen forced integration occur, or respect for civil rights very gradually start to germinate on a wide scale. So I think that as this applies to the point about the Civil War in France, I am not necessarily fixated on this idea that we need to have a tripart division of powers, the way that, say, Montesquieu or the founding fathers argue. Uh, there are uses for it, and we can have a kind of nuanced argument about it. What I am more focused on is the idea that any kind of democratic system that we're going to create is nonetheless going to need to be extremely respectful of certain fundamental rights that people should have over and against the majority. Otherwise, I become deeply concerned, like many liberals, that what you're going to get is not even a new kind of tyranny, but potentially the most vicious kind of mature tyranny that can be conceived.
Right. But what do you think? And this is sort of again another fundamental philosophical question here, but I think it's worth talking about. Is, what are we really grounding out our beliefs on? What are we really doing? Because I think there's a danger here of essentially falling into political intuition where we just sort of say, I want this outcome, and so I'm going to design a system around this outcome. To give a direct example, I've heard you talk about sort of the danger of you want to protect minorities, not in the sense of like racial minorities, but just minorities in a state generally, versus the majority, which is what you're describing right now. Um, and I've read like books, recent books like How Democracies Die, or similar books about how
Mhm.
America is too, our system is actually too interested in protecting minorities in some sense, and we can't actually pass amendments to the Constitution. We can't pass laws in general. We can't do things that the majority would want to do, and we actually want to allow the
Mhm.
majority to take those actions. But the problem is that again, repeating my beginning of this, those views happen to align perfectly with the political inclinations of the authors, right? They want to be able to say democracy is bad when, in your example, slavers are getting rid of the rights of, the slaves. But they also want to be able to say we need to be able to pass amendments really quickly if the majority wants to, because these amendments will protect abortion and things like that. And these are things that we intuitively like based on political instincts, but I think it gets a lot harder when we try to actually ground these consistently, philosophically, and it becomes hard for me to yeah, I really want us to be clear and open and honest about like the risks there, I guess.
Sure.
That you're just that you are just falling into intuition, even if and there isn't really a great consistency there, especially when we're talking about things like democracy. And yeah, I just think that's why I asked that question, because I think that's extraordinarily difficult to deal with.
Sure. Well, look, David Hume once pointed out that at a certain point in any kind of philosophical discussion, you hit what's sometimes termed philosophical bedrock, right? Which is if we're not necessarily relying on intuitions, relying on kind of axiomatic modes of reasoning, beyond which there's really no getting beneath. Now, I think that it's untrue that Hume reached philosophical bedrock in his own work. And I think that the history of metaethics, certainly from the 20th century onwards, show that actually there are far deeper ruminations you can make about the grounding of value. Now, personally, my own kind of metaethical orientation is towards Parfitian style quasi-cognitive moral realism, right? Essentially, to use Parfit's analogy, I see norms as being something that are rather akin to mathematical entities in the sense that they are the creation of human cognition, right? I don't believe that there's a kind of platonic two out there in reality that we're just waiting to discover in eternity.
Right.
It's something that the mind conceives a priori. Nonetheless, it's not a subjective matter whether 2 + 2 = 4, right? The kind of laws of logic that are the products of human cognition have a kind of internal consistency to them, as do the laws of mathematics that we have to be beholden to. And so too does normativity. So that's just a kind of gesture towards the deepest dimensions of what you're talking about. In terms of the kind of democratic question and what grounds it, here I'll turn to Dworkin again. I think that fundamentally what you see in a lot of these left authors, whether we're talking about Samuel Moyn or Erwin Chemerinsky or myself, right? People have argued for democratizing many aspects of the American constitutional order while still retaining respect for anti-majoritarian features like individual rights. Is this impulse to say there needs to be more equality in American society? And the reason that Dworkin would give, and I think this is correct, is fundamentally our equality can be understood as, again, an architectonic value. Because what you're essentially saying when people are equal, we're saying that all people are equal, is that all life is sacred. And that it is as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well, as that somebody in Namibia's life goes well, as that somebody in India's life goes well. No one gains nobody gets special credit for their life going well,
Right.
right? And aligned with that, of course, is a commitment to freedom. Since you have a special responsibility for your life going well in the same way that I have a special responsibility for my life going well, is the same way that the person in Namibia has a special responsibility for their life going well, which means that we should be allowed wide discretion to make the choices that are appropriate to ensure that our lives goes well, because we're different individuals, we have different kinds of needs, and here's my own illiberalism showing up. I don't think the state or majority should have an entitlement to say, for the most part, how it is that you should live your life, because they don't necessarily know you as well as you probably know yourself. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? I think that there are good reasons to prevent you from drunk driving, for example, even if you think that that would be conducive to your well-being. But we don't need to mince those right now. So taken together, my kind of quasi-cognitive moral realist stance is that life does have a certain kind of intrinsic value to it. your life has an intrinsic value to it in the same sense that mine does. And once you recognize that there's a clear egalitarian quality to this, in the sense that is as important as anyone else's life goes well as that my life goes well, and nobody gets again special credit for that.
Right.
And I align that with support for more democratic systems, um, as long as again those are tempered by respect for certain kinds of fundamental rights, although not a fundamental right to private ownership of the means of production, which is of course the socialist dimension of
Right.
liberal socialism.
Right. Of course, yeah. And then, so I want to go back to actually Marxism a little bit. Some more questions I had about that. Um, so the most attractive thing to me about Marxism is this concept of Bonapartism.
Sure.
So I read the 18th Brumaire, and I just, yeah, it had a really big effect on me. And I don't really care for the very liberal conception of Bonapartism as just being a synonym for like fascism or like a dictator. I think there's something more to that idea, which is that there's something to the capitalist state, the modern capitalist state. There's very class oriented, except it's very confusing and muddled, and there's different class relationships, and sometimes this can manifest in an outright dictator demagogue like Bonaparte or Trump. And that's why this is very attractive to me, is because it's really hard for me as a more traditional liberal to understand why my beautiful system is creating Donald Trump. I have to figure that out. I don't want that to happen. That's my intuitions coming in there. I don't want that to happen. I don't want Donald Trump to run a state. I think that's just a mess. Okay, so I'm looking at this theory, and it's basically saying that the reason this is happening is because of class and certain uh, ideas that are very unorthodox to my thinking. And I really wanted to ask you, what do you think about Bonapartism? Do you, because I don't hear you talk about it very often. Do you think it's an important aspect of how you see the world? Is this what you're talking about when you talk about the theory of power that Marx brings in? Is this how related is it to this? And yeah, I'd just like to hear you talk about that.
No, actually, my argument that for incorporating a Marxist theory of power into liberal socialism is actually much more influenced by people like just use some contemporaries, Soren Mao or Bruno Leopold, right? Both of them argue that the kind of mute compulsion induced by capitalism constitutes a form of domination, which we have good reason to want to liberate ourselves from. Or if you want to go back further, I'm very influenced by certain kind of Western Marxists, like Lukács, for example. I'm a huge fan of history and class consciousness, and also, of course, his enormously important book on the right, along with Adorno, Horkheimer, all the others, many of whom talk about the importance of reification as a
Right.
kind of inclusion of social reality that inhibits us from undertaking the necessary reforms in order to transform society for the better. Actually, I have a pretty long essay coming out about this in Damage Magazine soon. Now, saying that, I think that the Bonapartist thesis, excuse me, that you brought up in the 18th Brumaire is a brilliant one. It's a really good example of Marx um, engaging in concrete political analysis of a contemporary situation, but in a way that is trans-historical, to be a little bit cheeky, in terms of its insights. Because what I think that is really important, what I think it's that's really important that Marx discovers here is how capable the right can be at appropriating progressive and liberal rhetoric in order to advance itself politically,
Mm-hmm.
uh, with the intention of pursuing, of course, fundamentally reactionary goals once in power. This is one of the things that he points out, right? That the appeal of Napoleon III, as he became called, was essentially that for at least a brief period of time, he could be all things to all people, right? He could be the socialist emperor who would be concerned with the labor movement and would build sewers and would establish order for the working classes. He could be the liberal emperor who would expand the empire, right, and create new economic opportunities for capital. And of course, he could appeal to the French right because he reestablished the monarchy, broke the back of the republic, was an ardent nationalist, right, and all those kinds of things. And I think that the insight that Marx brings to this is by pointing out that in any of these circumstances where one tries, as so many fascist and rightists try to do, to create a secret third way between left and right, what inevitably ends up happening is you go right. Right.
Right.
Napoleon III smashed the various liberatory movements that existed in the empire, co-opted them in some circumstances, and offered breadcrumbs to the people who are concerned about things like workers' rights. But that all neutered any kind of radical emancipatory potential, even for a more republican system of government that many people in France aspired to. The only thing that I could really add to Marx's analysis, which is brilliant, I mean, in that essay, Even conservatives have acknowledged, I should say, its brilliance. Waller Newell, the great Straussian scholar in Tyranny and Empire, point out that Marx's analysis in that essay is really second to none in terms of its insight and candor. Is I think that Marx sometimes underappreciates the appeal of reactionary ideology and reactionary rhetoric, which is a recurring theme throughout my work, right? I point out that if you think about the left's pitch is almost always, if you live in a more egalitarian society where you treat other people like equals to yourself, and other people treat you like an equal, then we're all going to be better off. That's putting it really simply, of course, but that's the kind of fundamental pitch. Well, that's very appealing to people like me, many others on the left, certainly for many marginalized people and working class people. It's always been a compelling argument. But the right's argument, especially to its base constituencies, is always actually you're better than everyone else, right? Your morality is higher, your race is pure, your gender is set to be superior. And you know what the problem is? That all those nasty leftists, they've taken that away from you, right? There, but for their presence and the presence of these natural subordinates who side with the leftists, you would be a king, at least in your own little territory. So get behind me and we'll restore you to the status you belong to. Well, for a lot of people, being told that you are an innate superior or a dispossessed aristocrat is naturally going to be a lot more appealing than being told that you're the equal to another person. Right? Who doesn't want, at least in some moments, to imagine that they're better than anyone else? And I think until the left really begins to appreciate the power of reactionary rhetoric, and also occasionally, and I want to be very cautious here, the depths of conservative thinking, and I again put a big asterisk on that. I think that we're always going to be, if not back-footed, at least at a disadvantage in the battle of ideas and in the battle of ideologies.
Right. A little bit more on that. It seems to me that Marxists tend to take that in a different direction, where they say Bonapartism is not just a warning about the right. It is a statement of the entire modern state, and so no matter if you're talking about parliamentary Britain or Bismarck in Germany or Bonaparte himself, this is all Bonapartism in the sense that it's describing the modern state. And you could use sort of I think this is Gramsci, like a different types of Bonapartism, where there's a kind where you could say FDR is a
Sure.
Bonapartist figure, and the reason that he is that is because the capitalist state itself is sort of a monstrosity that's reorganizing itself, and FDR represents an attempt at taming the people you're talking about and appealing to them in a way that we find it's very soft. It's whatever. It's not requiring that the system is overturned or anything like that. Whereas Bonaparte is the more extreme manifestation of this monstrosity, where it's like kind of taking the mask off and saying, I need to start abridging the Constitution and conquering Italy and doing wild stuff like that. And in either case, this is a fundamental state of existence. This is Bonapartism. Both of these are the same thing manifesting itself in different ways. And I think this is how many orthodox Marxists, or at least certain kinds of Marxists, interpret that. What do you think about that? Do you disagree with that? Do you think there's something of value there, or do you think yeah, what do you think?
I think there's an enormous amount of value provided that we are sufficiently granular in our interpretation of different manifestations of Bonapartism. So there's a very crude, kind of vulgar Marxist narrative around Bonapartism, which essentially sees it as a break glass for the capitalist class whenever it's in an emergency situation, right? You got a lot of socialist movements emerging, more radical forms of republicanism. Well, you break the glass, you bring in an authoritarian leader that's sufficiently charismatic, and everything is hunky dory, right? I see similar kinds of explanations sometimes used by vulgar Marxists to explain what happened with Italian fascism or
Right.
Nazism, for example, or to this day with Trumpism, right? You know, Bernie Sanders was gaining traction, Jeremy Corbyn was gaining traction, not enough, and so what you get a reactionary response backed by big capital. I think that is too reductive and too simplistic, and I think that Marx himself in the 18th Brumaire attests to this, where he points out again the ideological bricolage that was used in order to justify Bonaparte's ascension to power. So what I mean by this is that I think that what we need to realize is that ideologies are never static, and hegemony, in order to be maintained by the ruling classes, always needs to be reinvigorated and readjusted, given the contours of a given time. So this is my Vigekian take on Bonaparte. I think that what made Bonaparte a reactionary figure was precisely that he was able to restore a belief and the sacral qualities of the French monarchy, but in a way that was distinctly modern, right? Drawing upon people like Louis Philippe, who declared himself King of the French rather than King of France. Louis Bonaparte was notably plebiscitary in his approach to politics, right? There always needed to be this gesture in a
Right.
populist direction in order to suggest that his rule and his ascension of as emperor was a popular kind of manifestation of the general Rousseauian will, if you want. And that's very different from what you would see French reactionaries arguing for, even at the turn of the 19th century, where Joseph de Maistre would have been horrified by the idea that you need to gesture towards the people or seek the approval of the people at all in order to sacralize the monarchy. If anything, it's the other way around, right?
Right.
The people are lucky to have their monarch and are elevated by having the monarchy that they do. And we can move forward to fascism in the 20th century, right? I think that Walter Benjamin is very correct that fascism gained a lot of its appeal by the art of turning society into a form of entertainment for itself, using mass-produced forms of aesthetic representation. Representation is the wrong word. Aesthetic exaggeration of reality, right? And charismatic figures like Hitler and Mussolini were necessary in order to sell this aestheticization and to be the main character in it. But even they, of course, gestured to the idea that it was the German people and destiny that had elected them. Not directly, of course, in many cases, but in spirit, to be the leader of this process of palingenetic rejuvenation that was going to require these big, exciting, bold projects like imperial expansion, etc. And that's quite different, again, from what you would see classical reactionaries like de Maistre or even Thomas Carlyle arguing for, because it's much more demagogic in its quality. So all that's to say, I think that what comes through in the Brumaire very, very potently is precisely through Marx's analysis how a different kind of ideological characteristics can be bricolaged together. In order to re-entrench or establish new forms of hegemonic class rule. And we always need to be sensitive to how effective aspirational ruling elites are going to be at just this kinds of project. And we do ourselves a disservice if we just think that we are endlessly facing the same kind of ruling elite again and again and again. So the problems that we face in 2025 are really just the same kind of problems that we faced in 1848 or elsewhere or elsewhen.
Right. Um, yeah, that makes sense. Although I do want to bring up I mean, this is essentially the same point again. But I do want to bring it up just to. It seems to me that Marx is sort of gesturing at that idea that there is something that is the same no matter what time it is. And what I would point to is number one, in the 18th Brumaire, he's intensely critical of the left, and he basically says that the left liberals, the Monton, if they're the left liberals at best, or the left or whatever, they didn't do anything. They gestured towards military action, but they weren't actually going to do that, and then they gestured towards democracy, but they didn't really have democratic appeal and it was sort of delusional. And then they gestured at like the system, but he says the system was already degraded by the liberals themselves. In fact, he says that the French Constitution, even before Bonaparte, was all empty. There's an article where he goes through each aspect of like one of the constitutions, and he says this wasn't held up, this wasn't held up, this wasn't held up, this was violated. And so he seems to have a sense that the Constitution and the liberals all across the board they're all empty, they're all violating it, they're all part of the same problem. And there's also, separately in his writings on Britain, when he's talking about the parliamentary politics, he seems to do the same thing where he says the liberals, what were the liberals essentially, were they they gestured to being different than the conservatives, but they were all basically the same thing. They all basically had the same bourgeois, semi-aristocratic impulses. The conservatives, the Tories, were slightly more unapologetic about their aristocratic influences, but ultimately they're all playing the same game. And when it really comes down to it, when you had the coalition cabinet, which had, I think, politicians from both parties, and it was a great moment of we saved Britain, guys. Everyone's on the same team. He looked at that as horrifying. He said, "Yeah, of course they're all on the same team. They're all playing the same game, and they're all fundamentally the same in some ways. And this is horrifying, and I hate this." And lastly, I would put forth the one of the invasions of China. I guess it's the Second Opium War, where he basically says that Palmerston, who was a conservative, but Palmerston was able to sell this in Parliament, and he was able to say, "Listen, our tea is more expensive," and this is similar to the populist rhetoric you're referring to in the 18th Brumaire, where he was able to appeal to the population. But the crucial thing is that most of Parliament was on his side. They were all happy to become nationalists and go to war with China and all of that. So really, I really want to. I think there is something in Marx where he's saying that all of Parliament, all liberals are corrupt. They're all in on this at varying levels. And whereas you're focusing a lot more on the right and the extreme excesses, it seems like there is something in Marx that is taking that criticism further to apply to all liberals and all of bourgeois democracy and all of it. And yeah, I'm wondering if you agree that Marx takes it there, or it sounds like you disagree. But yeah, I'd like to hear what you think.
No, I'd agree that certainly at the time of the 18th Brumaire, he was in one of his more characteristically anti-liberal moods. Let's put it this way, right? So Marxist thinking on liberalism is complex, variegated, and evolves, and not only evolves, but evolves in multiple directions over the course of his career, right? Certainly in 1848, up until about 1851, he's enormously critical of many aspects of bourgeois regimes, right? Or bourgeois revolutionaries, for that matter. Now, again, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, he always applauds the revolutionary role that the bourgeois class played in bringing about the partial downfall of feudalism, although there was still much to be done. But he's also deeply contemptuous of the fact that they seem very willing to conciliate with feudalism and fail to play that historical role in many circumstances, or where they just are not particularly politically savvy. So they'll launch a revolution with the intention of bringing about a republican system of government, like say in Austria or the Austrian Empire, and just completely fail to do so, leading to various forms of reactionary restoration, or in the case, again, of Louis Bonaparte, the creation of a new kind, I would argue, of reactionary regime. Now, saying that, by the time you get to the 1870s, 1860s, I should say, really, Marx has a somewhat different understanding of bourgeois thinking, and for that matter, also bourgeois ideology and its relationship with the right. He often characterizes conservative and reactionary thinkers, to use terminology in one letter, as beneath contempt. They're anti-intellectual. They rely exclusively on sentimental appeals to nostalgia in order to justify their kinds of positions. So there's no point in arguing with them. He almost takes this notion of that they're so pathologically incapable of thinking rationally that there's really nothing you can do for them because they're so ideologically driven. You know, you're just going to have to wait for society to rid them of their illusions or hope that they get a good therapist, I suppose. By contrast, he's very clear that bourgeois thinking stands at a higher intellectual level and does require intellectual engagement. So, for example, in the Grundrisse, he points out that people like Adam Smith, for example, was undoubtedly right in developing this notion that there are laws of political economy that are operative in contemporary societies, and that the goal of political economy and political economic analysis has to be to do more than just to describe particular economic scenarios, but instead to comprehend these laws in their totality. What Marx adds, of course, and I think quite correctly, is that Smith and other bourgeois thinkers mixed the historical dimension of these laws. They assumed that they were trans-historical and operative in every given society because more or less the bourgeois social form was also the appropriate one for any given society, or every society was just a bourgeois society in germ. And Marx thinks this is ridiculous,
Right.
and I think rightly so. We don't need to get into that too much, though. Just again to make clear that I think that his appreciation of liberalism was always much more complex and much more vacillatory than his approach to conservatism or the right. And I think this is also, I should add, a prevailing weakness of a lot of Marxism, right? And a lot of Marxist analysis, which tends to conflate liberalism with reactionary discourse and with the right consistently, despite the fact that, sadly, many people on the right are far more aware of both how much in common liberalism and socialism and Marxism, for that matter, have with one another than they do with many people on the right, and also with their own about their own distinct political identity. Again, think about people like Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Heidegger, even people like Michael Oakeshott, for that matter. So I think that the Marxist tradition as a whole would benefit from taking a more granular approach to distinctions between liberalism and conservatism or the right. Unfortunately, there's some positive steps or positive indications that we are moving on from that. I mentioned, Lukash's book, The Destruction of Reason, which has enjoyed a healthy resurgence recently. That book also tends to conflate liberalism with reaction a little bit too much, but there's a lot of interesting things in it. Or you can think about Larry Allen Bust, the great Marxist thinker's book, The Right Wing Mirror of Critical Theory, which is a very deep and very learned analysis of Hayek, Schmidt, Strauss, and Oakeshott, which is quite knowledgeable of what differentiates these thinkers from liberals, in no small part because he takes seriously the fact that certainly Schmidt understood that he was no liberal, right? And for good reason. So I think there's improvements that we're seeing, but we still have a long way to go in the Marxist tradition.
So you would say ultimately that Marx is intensely critical of liberals, but what we need to take from that is that we should be better liberals, in a sense, right? Not to throw out the entire liberal tradition, but we can just be better. That seems to be like one of your claims about what we can learn from Marx or how we can take that. Whereas many Marxists do just want to throw out the entire tradition. We don't want to have anything to do with liberalism. I mean, that's a very simple way of stating it, but it seems like that.
Absolutely, and I think that that's very counter to Marx's own orientation, right? I mean, Marx did not spend hundreds of pages talking about Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or David Ricardo because he thought that there was nothing to learn from them or that they were all trash and just
Right.
deserved to be relegated to the ash bin of history, right? Uh, Marx did not think that Hegel, who himself became something of a right-wing liberal, was just a worthless thinker. He
Right.
characterized himself as a pupil of that mighty thinker, even if he thought that Hegel understood the world upside down, right, and needed to be
Mm-hmm.
turned right side up. I think that this propensity to perennially want to dismiss liberalism as nothing more than reactionary ideology with a bit of pathological limitations built into it really says a lot more about Marxism than it does about liberalism. Which isn't to say, of course, that there are plenty of liberals out there that fall into the Marxist caricature, right? People like Noah Smith or Matt Iglesias or, God forbid, Hillary Clinton, right? Almost read like figures that have emerged from Marxist fiction, as just completely incapable of doing anything right, and constantly blaming the electorate for not wanting to put their faith in them. So there's still gas in that tank, but I think people like say Tony Smith in his great book Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, which is a sharp critique of Rawls, Nussbaum, other people who kind of identify as left liberals, is a much more useful template for the kind of Marxist theorizing I'd like to see going forward. Because it actually enacts a useful dialogue between left liberalism and Marxism that's learned, knowledgeable, and takes seriously the arguments of left liberals while being critical of them. And that's just a much more interesting thing for me to do than one more boring person saying, reactionary liberalism has nothing to teach us; it just needs to be smashed. It's like, well, we've been saying that for 200 years, and we still seem incapable of learning anything from our failure to do that. So maybe it's time to move on, man.
Yeah. And then I think the last major question about Marxism itself, um, there is a very strong attachment, of course, to Lenin in the socialist Marxist tradition. And then Stalin cuts a lot of those people out. A lot of people who like Lenin won't endorse Stalin. And then, of course, there's Rosa Luxemburg, who is probably fairly adjacent to Lenin.
Sure.
But I really want to ask you, where do you draw the line on these movements? Do you draw the line at? Do you think there was something to what Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg were trying to do that we should respect? Do we take their side against the SPD in Germany, or what do we? Yeah, where do you draw the line with revolutionary socialists who were wrong, or maybe they were close to being correct? I mean, yeah, really, where do you draw the line with these people?
Well, that's a very complicated question, right? And I have a lot of respect for both the Russian revolutionaries, including the bourgeois Russian revolutionaries and the German revolutionaries. And I don't want to kind of say, let's call it backseat drive a revolution, or ex post facto say, if only I had done this, then everything would have gone differently because I didn't live in those circumstances. I will say that had I lived in Germany in the 1920s or 1910s, excuse me, uh, I would without a doubt have been with Edward Bernstein and thinking that the mainstream of the SPD was becoming far too reactionary and was far too willing to conciliate with German capital and, for that matter, the German military. Uh, I would have also probably been wary of the most extreme wings of, say, the Spartacist movement and arguing that what we need is complete revolution of German society, whether or not that's what most Germans want, or whether or not that's even theoretically or historically possible at this moment, because I would argue that the achievement of a democratic socialist state that nonetheless has certain kinds of parliamentary features would be an enormous advance forward. Now, of course, we all know that the very convoluted kind of Weimar Republic that ended up emerging was highly unstable. Of course, gave way to various kinds of to the worst kinds of reactionary movements. In this case, reactionary fascism, a la Nazism, and there's been an endless amount of debate and an endless amount of finger pointing about who let that happen. Of course, many liberals and even some conservatives argue that it's all the communist fault and the
Right.
socialist fault. Moderate socialists will often argue that it's the KPD's fault because they characterized all socialists as social fascists. And then, of course, the communists argue that really it's the social fascists' fault because they betrayed them during the German Revolution, sold out the revolution, and so there could be no cooperating with them. I suppose, the most interesting thing I could say is that in those circumstances, I would have very much been ringing the alarm bell and saying we can all put aside our differences to form the common front against a vicious form of reactionary politics that's going to wipe us all out the first chance it gets, which is, of course, immediately what happened. But again, I appreciate the fact that I didn't live in those circumstances. I wasn't defined by those kinds of animosities. It's very easy for me to tell the communists of the 1930s that they should back the SPD because it's the most likely electoral vehicle to prevent the Nazis from gaining power. When I was betrayed by members of the SPD during the German Revolution. Let's just put it that way.
Right. And then on Lenin, I mean, Chomsky takes the view that Lenin betrayed mainstream Marxism and became sort of a reactionary who just wanted to impose his will. And Stalin, of course, is like way too far across the line if you say that about Lenin. Do you agree with Chomsky there, or do you think that there's, yeah, how close are you to the Chomsky position on Lenin?
I've been wrestling with this back and forth for a long time, right? In no small part because there's, again, endless debates about whether Stalinism constituted a betrayal of Leninism, and Trotskyism would have been a more sincere inheritor of the Leninist tradition. Of course, there's speculation about what would happen had Lenin not died young,
Right.
whether there would have been a transition to a more democratic social form, even with some market characteristics, the way there was early on under the Bolshevik regime. Again, I really don't like playing hypothetical historian, right? As much fun as it can be when I'm,
Right.
playing Europa Universalis or Hearts of Iron or whatever it happens to be, because it's like, well, who knows? I think if you want me to say what I appreciate about Lenin, which is I think what I'd be comfortable doing, I think that he was an extraordinarily adept political analyst. In many ways, the Machiavelli of the left with all the
Right.
virtues or virtues and limitations that entails. I also think that he was a Marxist theorist of some note from which we have a lot to learn, particularly the imperialism essay and his criticism of empiricism, especially, right? And very savvily, Lenin often intimates that more reflective forms of idealism can often be more progressive than the crudest kinds of empiricism, which very often end up, to use a Lacanian term, reifying the existing world as it is.
Mm.
And so lapping, ironically, into the worst kinds of idealism, that which just take the social world to be immutable. So again, I think that there's a lot to learn from Lenin's essays. Uh, what I don't have any patience for is people who will defend the Maoist regime or the Stalinist regime, typically by arguing, well, industrialization was a brutal process in the West. Every Marxist understands this, and it was a brutal process in China and a brutal process, in Russia. But nonetheless, they became comparatively industrialized economies. Or by pointing out, well, but Stalin was essential, or at least the Stalinist regime was essential in defeating the Nazis. 80% of Axis forces were located on the Eastern Front. All of that may be true, right? But I find it normatively not just unpalatable, but unacceptable to say that that is worth the price of millions and tens of millions of people dying, right? And I would ask any leftist who would invoke that kind of rhetoric whether they'd be comfortable with a proponent of the British Empire saying, well, yes, it's case that the Great Bengal famine ended up killing 4 million people. But think about this: we helped industrialize many of those societies. We brought them many in forms of modern institutions. Constitutionalism is an essential achievement that the British Empire helped spread. Would there be basic notions of individual rights in many of those countries had it not been for the British Empire? Anybody who tried to defend the British Empire along those lines can kiss my ass and go to hell, as far as I'm concerned, given the atrocities that it committed. And I am just not willing to accept the bifurcation that the only way that we could have industrialized and defeated Hitler is by allowing authoritarian regimes to persist for decades that threatened and actively destroyed the lives of millions of their own citizens.
Yeah. Do you think that there's something in Marx that lends itself to that orientation? Because I mean, Marx does say he gets very close to saying, or basically says that the British are doing horrible things in India, but it's necessary, and hopefully that they'll get over their backwardness and become liberal. And even though I don't endorse it, they're going to not be backward anymore. So we must acknowledge that. Do you think there's something in Marx that lends itself to that feeling, or do you think it's a misunderstanding of Marx? Or
I think it's a misunderstanding of Marx. Without a doubt, every now and then he did invoke teleological sounding rhetoric about, let's call it the cunning of reason, right? Bringing about positive outcomes, even through very negative kinds of means. And I think that at his best, Marx was always a lot more skeptical that there was less contingency in history and more abject necessity. Than some people would imply. Uh, and I think that if you look at Marx's political analyses, for instance, in the 18th Brumaire, it's very clear that he sneered at many forms of imperialism and patriotism and national forms of militarist aggrandizement. He was a complicated thinker who lived a long and very politically active life. And I think that where he applies teleological modes of reasoning to his account of history, then he is being inconsistent with his own methodological orientation, understood in his most plausible possible formulation. Let's just put it that way.
right. And then I wanted to also talk to you about your decision to talk about Dostoevsky in your book, The Right and Political Equality,
Sure.
because you talk about him in quite a bit. And essentially, the argument you make, I think, is that he has what I would call kind of like a small Christianity, in the
Sure.
sense that it has a very small scale. He really wants to. He thinks that there's something enormously beneficial and wonderful about being a good person on a small scale, but he has no hope for the state. And in kind of not caring about the state, he kind of becomes reactionary in that sense. Whereas you say that Tolstoy, he did care about a broader sense of Christian morality, and he considers if we are Christians, we must care about everyone in society, and that ends up caring about the state, and then you have a much more broad and less reactionary form of Christianity or form of thought. And I wanted to ask you, well, I guess number one, if that conception is correct, if that is a good way of summarizing your position on that. And number two, I also wanted to ask you about your decision to include and talk about Dostoevsky, because I think um, a lot of books of this kind, they want to stick to political thinkers, philosophers, and you would not include Dostoevsky because he was not either of those things explicitly, but he did undeniably touch on those topics in a very deep way. And so, yeah, what do you think about that decision to include him? And was that difficult or was that easy? And how do you understand that sort of thing?
Well, I think it was a very easy decision, and there are two major reasons. One is just if you look at the influence of Dostoevsky on the political right, especially its most seminal thinkers, like Nietzsche, for example, right? Or even lesser figures like Ayn Rand. It's been enormous, right? There's just no denying that influence. And so any charitable reading of the political right that didn't account for his influence and to trying to understand it, I think would be inadequate in a lot of ways. The second reason I included, which is related to the first one, is I think that along with Nietzsche, and I'll add Burke there as well, Dostoevsky just stands at the summit of the political right and its intellectual, moral, and spiritual acumen. And I think that if we want, as leftists, to know our enemy in the parlance of the day and engage with them in a steelman form, it's important to take seriously his objections and to try to come up with cogent responses to them that move in a more progressive direction, which is part of the reason I included the Tolstoy material in that text, right? Because I think that Tolstoy doesn't answer Dostoevsky directly, but he very effectively, I think, answers Dostoevskian type arguments from a Christian leftist, maybe Christian socialist perspective, depending on who you talk to, right? So in the book, I argue that there are three main arguments that Dostoevsky makes against the left. This is summarizing, right, from both his political writings, obviously his great novels, his short stories, speeches he gave defending various forms of reactionary politics. And the reason why I think that the three arguments are not only cogent but powerful is, as I point out, Dostoevsky himself was a man of the left early on in his life. He never was an atheist per se. In fact, he was always quite wary of socialist and liberal atheism. But when he was moving around in radical circles in Russia early in his life, he was deeply sympathetic to socialist modernizing arguments that centered the need to look after the poor. He was desperate to see the emancipation of the serfs. And all this got him in trouble, of course, with the czarist authorities, who feigned a mock execution, where they were all lined up and they were going to be shot. And the last minute, the czar commuted their sentence. He got a free vacation to Siberia. Let's just put it this way. And Dostoevsky is very transparent about where his own reactionary views started to emerge and why he started to abandon socialism. A lot of it was from being in prison in Siberia, where he spent an enormous amount of time with the working class. And he says, while he was working with the working classes, he realized two things. First off, a lot of these kind of proto-socialist or overtly socialist hagiographies about the goodness of the poor were trash, right? Yeah, there were a lot of good poor people, but plenty of people who were working class would happily sell out their mothers for a buck if they got the chance, right? So that was a big problem. And he also points out how the working class prisoners that he was locked up with held no one in greater contempt than middle class left wing intellectuals like himself, who purported to speak for the poor, because they thought that they were tourists, if you want, in a world that they didn't really understand and consequently had no right to speak for. Whereas at least, the aristocrats and the ruling classes didn't even make the pretense of caring about what happened in the life of the poor, except for here or there. So there was kind of good, brutal honesty to that. And when he came out, he was a changed man, as he would be after spending many years in a Siberian prison. I think he came to the wrong conclusions about how politics should be organized. But without a doubt, Dostoevsky came to his reactionary attitudes, for, let's not call it realistic reasons, for understandable reasons, right? He wasn't a bad faith interlocutor. So the three arguments that he brings up in this books are there's a satirical argument, a psychological argument, and then a more so-called metaphysical, even theological argument. And I know I've been talking for a lot, so I'll just go very briefly through them. So the satirical argument is in Demons, especially, and No for the Underground, Dostoevsky offers one of the best lampoons of the left and leftist circles that you're ever going to read on the right. Part of the reason is, unlike people like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, who produce movies like Lady Ballers, he actually spent time amongst real left wingers and read left wing philosophy and all that stuff. So he kind of knew who we were. And so there was real bite to the satire. Just to give an example, there's a radical circle that meets in the small town that's at the centerpiece of Demons. Everyone literally goes around and discusses what pronouns and what titles to use to introduce one another, despite their egalitarianism. They spend hours and hours talking about the need to actually do something when really everything just evolves into these very opaque theoretical debates about who's more scientific and who's more realistic. And then at the end, there's a guy who stands up and says, My theory is purely scientific. It makes no kinds of suppositions about the way that the world is. This is Shigalov, right? And sadly, starting from unlimited freedom, I ended with unlimited despotism. Nonetheless, my strategy is the only one that we need to implement because it's required by Shigalov doesn't use the term, but the cutting of history or the arc of history, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and anyone who's spent any time in left-wing circles dealing with a bunch of insecure people, oftentimes who are trying to intellectually one up one another, will be kind of familiar with the ambiance that's going there. Certainly, I felt targeted a little bit by it here or there, right? Then the second argument that he uses is a psychological one, where he points out, and this is especially true in Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov, that the adoption of left-wing ideals inevitably leads one in fundamentally psychologically tense directions that can't be reconciled with one another. You can't live by them consistently. Now, there are innumerable examples of this in Crime and Punishment and his other work, but I'll just give an important one. Raskolnikov is constantly torn between theories of social determinism that hold that people are largely the product of their environment, which again I pointed out many left wingers believe, while also thinking it's very important for people to be emancipated, to be free. Right, the more freedom we have, the better off we'll be, or at least that's a philosophy sometimes flirts with embracing. Dostoevsky points out that there's an enduring tension between holding to these two positions, since if you believe that people are largely the product of their social environment, you kind of buy into these very strong deterministic ideas about human beings and why we end up being the way we are. And you might ask yourself, well, what's the point of freeing people, so called, from certain social institutions when any other social institutions you create are just going to determine their outcomes then? By contrast, this kind of hyper liberatory rhetoric that's embraced almost invariably leads one towards these very moralistic, judgmental attitudes towards people that are supposed to be directly contrary to the left's important emphasis on kindness, forgiveness, etc., etc. Right? So that's just one example given in that book, and there are many others. Then the last argument he uses is again a more metaphysical and even theological argument, which is kind of what you are getting at, and this is probably best expressed in the brothers Karamazov, although you also see it in Diary of the Writer and others, where, and this is an enduring reactionary theme, Dostoevsky takes the fundamental leftist orientation to be that we need to try to bring about a better world for everyone in the here and now, right? There's this mayorist, even utopian urge in leftism that is very, very hard to inoculate yourself against. And he thinks that there are many expressions of this that have appeared throughout history, right? The Catholic Church is a good example of this. A lot of leftists, especially Western leftists, would kind of raise an eyebrow at that, but he was an orthodox figure. Socialism, liberalism, you get the idea. And he thinks that any effort to try to remove all the roots of suffering in human society is destined to fail, right? Because we are fundamentally, if not sinful beings, at least deeply flawed beings. And so any attempt to build a perfect society in our own image is invariably going to just end up replicating the various flaws and ugliness that is so often a consistent feature of human life. And the more we try to deny that that's what's going to happen, the uglier it is that things are likely to end up looking, right? Instead, he looks to individual acts of grace and kindness as, if not the best that we can hope for, since of course we might hope for an afterlife where we are actually happy, right? In this world, that's probably the best that we can do. Be a good person, right? Treat your family and your friends and your loved ones with respect and with decency, right? Go to church, earn a little bit of money, don't gamble like Dostoevsky did, and things will be better off, right? Now, in the Brothers Karamazov, this is also offset by some very interesting arguments by somebody who does represent the impulse of modernity, Ivan Karamazov, right? Who is the person who articulates the story of the Grand Inquisitor. And sometimes you get the sense that Dostoevsky does actually still sympathize with Ivan, who's without a doubt the most intelligent, thoughtful, and indeed spiritually deep person in many ways in the book. But diving into the nature of this dialectic would take us really deep into the text, but we don't need to. It's nonetheless, I think, a quite profound critique of the left that anybody who has mayorist or politically aspirational impulses like myself needs to take very seriously indeed.
Yeah, and I think there's also kind of a yeah, the psychological and the theological aspect are kind of meet each other, and
Oh yes.
I think this is where you see Jordan Peterson to some extent, because in Demons, one of the big problems in Demons, on top of just like the revolutionaries doing their thing, is the characters are dealing with like fundamental states of existence, right? I mean, Kirilov
Yep.
basically says, "I'm going to kill myself to spite God," and Stavrogan is struggling with existing and his morality and all these things. And then you can also see this in Karamazov, where everything is permitted and all of this. And there's very much this idea that if you, and this is definitely a religious argument, but the idea is that if you become atheist, then you have no morals and you are dooming yourself to like the worst form of nihilism, where you have no values and you become homicidal or suicidal or something along those lines. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think you have to deal with this argument. It's very much kind of aesthetic and psychological. It's just sort of one of those things that you just intuitively feel or you don't. Um, and Jordan Peterson uses this. I feel like every time he talks, he invokes this idea that once you cross a certain line, you're evil. You know, you have to avoid the evil people. You know, women have to avoid evil people. Women are tempted to talk to evil people. Men are tempted to become evil. There's just this like obsession with that problem. But anyway, moving on
If
from
I could
that.
just add one more
Yeah.
thing to that, just contemporize a little bit. I think that one of the reasons I brought up one of the reasons I brought up the Dostoevsky material also is I think the left could be extremely good at answering people's emotional, psychological, and spiritual questions because there's an extraordinarily rich tradition of progressive psychology, theology,
Hmm.
et cetera. But a lot of us don't end up doing that, right? Which I think is a serious mistake, even from a kind of an influencer standpoint, because what we end up doing is seeding the ground for to the answering those kinds of questions to the right, which is why people like Peterson or Andrew Tate will come in and say, the left just tells you need to politically change everything in order for you to lead a good life. What I'm telling you is get fit, embrace religion, return as a V, and find a girlfriend or a wife, and everything will be okay, right? These are all very bad answers to a lot of people's anxieties, but they are answers.
Hmm.
And I think that taking someone like Dostoevsky seriously and appreciating the rich parameters of life and trying to offer accounts of them from a left perspective is something that we could do to be more effective in shifting the hegemonic needle a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I mean, me asking you why you chose to include that. I mean, there's something that feels wrong about engaging in the argument on those terms because it just feels like a completely different kind of endeavor. And but you're right that in doing so, you are essentially ceding that ground, and that's a problem if you actually want to not cede ground and actually win things. So yeah, I think that's a really good point there. One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about was India a bit more. And the reason is that I think India is really interesting because a lot of their founding ideals are actually, you could say, liberal socialist. There's a lot of that idea. Nehru was very much a liberal, and he was also very much he wanted to be a socialist. He found things very appealing about socialism. He was wary of capitalism. He was wary of the effects that capitalism would have on society, but at the same time, he really wanted to have a strong constitution and strong rights. And I'm sure that many of the other founders of India had the same feeling. But unfortunately, what we see in India is that these ideals, we see an example of what happens when the ideals of a society or of a state haven't been able to fully penetrate the society, maybe simply due to like the scale of how big the country is or time or whatever it is, because they have welfare states. You know, a lot of the political parties live and die, whether left or right. They live and die on the idea that I'm going to give you money. I'm gonna help you eat and vote for me. And that's like kind of the worst form of welfare. The welfare state, where it's keeping these parties afloat, but they're not actually making change, and they're not substantively dealing with the rights that they want to guarantee. They want to get rid of the caste system. They want to guarantee rights for minorities and women. Those ideas were in the Constitution from the beginning, but they're not able to do so because they're sort of trapped in this cycle of making welfare promises. And of course, there is a cultural battlefield and sort of a right wing reactionary impulse, but at the same time, they're dealing with this like cycle. Um, yeah, what do you think about because I think you do have to test your theory in places other than the United States, right? So,
Sure.
why do you think that is, that they're stuck in that cycle? Do you think that's sort of a warning sign for how liberal socialism, the things you need to be careful about when you're constructing a society, whether it's constructing the constitution or when you're caring for people's needs but not able to get beyond that? Yeah, what do you think about that?
Sure. It's interesting you asked that because some of the most interested parties to the book and the project as a whole have been from India for exactly the reasons you mentioned. Uh, and many of my interlocutors there have stressed exactly the point that you made. So I think that you're onto something, right? In terms of maybe the resonance of liberal socialist ideas for that tradition. And I'm going to say to you what I said to them, which is I am not an expert on the Indian subcontinent, its history and its complexity. And boy, is there a lot of complexity there, right? We're talking about a country with almost 1.5 billion people at this point, with a tradition that stretches back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? So I don't want to weigh in excessively where I lack the expertise to speak cogently. Now, saying that, one example that does answer your concern, I think, would be what the communist government in Kerala has done very effectively, which is to try to combine welfarist measures with an approach to welfare that prioritizes gender equality. And by integrating the two together, they've in many ways respects been able to achieve the best of both worlds, right? While satisfying a large base of people. So just to give one example of this, once upon a time, one of the ways that the Kerala government tried to incentivize parents to send girls to school was just by offering them money to send girls to school. But because the enforcement mechanisms were extremely weak, oftentimes what ended up happening in these families is they would take the money and then they would send their daughters to work in factories anyway, which to a certain extent might be economically understandable because these are often very, very poor families. But the horrible negative consequence of this was, of course, women didn't get education. And we all know that, and statistical evidence repeatedly shows this, that educating women is absolutely crucial to development as a whole and to attaining a long-term flourishing society for a wide variety of reasons. So what the communist government did that was quite different was say, okay, rather than receiving money, every girl that goes to school will receive a high-calorie lunch, guaranteed, right? But you need to send them to school, and they need to stay there for at least a significant part of the day. Well, for a lot of the families, a high-calorie lunch is still a significant benefit to receive. Right? We're
Hmm.
talking about very, very poor people. They sent their daughters to school. They've got more educated. Many of them went into the tech sector quite young, surprisingly, right? And they were often better nutritionally well cared for than they would have been in other circumstances. So I think innovative approaches like that by a proudly left-wing government in a proudly left-wing state, right, demonstrates how you can integrate these concerns with for gender equality with concerns for material equality together in a way that's consistent, I think, with the values that many liberals and lady socialists would hold to, right? Uh, Whether or not one could emulate the kind of spirit of those policies elsewhere in India, there I just really don't know, right? Again, I
Hmm.
swear I need a lot more expertise and a lot more time to think it through.
Yeah, I actually think you can find echoes of many parts of our discussion, including the appeals of right wing rhetoric and also um, the psychological challenges of implementing these things. Because in Kerala, actually, the original communist chief minister, he was, I don't remember if he was he successfully was forced to step down. I feel like he was eventually, but essentially what happened was there was a huge protest movement against their government, and actually they were, even liberals would admit that their government was pretty solid. Like they were pretty
Yeah.
normal. Just they were just governing the state. They weren't doing anything radical, but they did make changes to the textbooks where they said, Russia's really cool, and they seemed to be a little bit too atheist. And many of the, including Christian, because Kerala is a very Christian state, and so many of the Christians, along with the Hindus, but I think probably Christians above all else, maybe the Muslims too, they were very upset by these textbook changes. And so there was a huge protest movement, and even police were attacking protesters. And I think this is a part I don't remember. I think Nehru ended up using the Constitution to remove him. And so this was just a huge complicated thing. So it really shows why I guess the left really needs to engage on multiple levels. You can't just run a country well, or run a state well in this case. You have to meet the cultural needs, because ultimately what caused that whole issue was a cultural question. It was textbooks, right? It was what people were being taught,
Mhm.
and that caused and leftists often want to focus all their energy on materialism and material needs. And ultimately, it didn't matter how material needs were being met if people felt their culture was going in a bad direction, psychologically and religiously. And I think that touches on multiple elements. So I think that's a good example for demonstrating why you have to meet your enemies, I guess, on multiple levels here. I think that's a good argument.
Absolutely.
Affirmatively,
And
yeah.
I mean, it was a very successful program by almost any metric. And in some ways, actually became a template for the school lunch program that now exists constitutionally across India, right? Although maybe not if Modi has his way for a long time, right? With at least the lunches be stamped with his face, since that's what bizarre fascists want to do. But I think that on the point about materialism, and let's just call it idealism, I think Marx and Engels were a lot more open-minded than again some vulgar Marxists appreciate. Engels in a famous letter pointed out that they had never intended to deny the importance of culture,
Mm.
tradition, and morality in political and historical change. What they perhaps did tactically was overemphasize the importance of material forces, precisely because so many reactionaries wanted to deny them any significance whatsoever. And I think that was entirely appropriate for Marx and Engels to do polemically, right? But we should never fall into the mistake of thinking that material forces and material motivations are the only things that drive people. That's a kind of vulgar materialist attitude to take. That again, I think to even invoke Lenin is less subtle and less effective for the left, even than a sophisticated idealism.
Right. Um, okay, I have two more kind of significant questions here. So I guess the first one is, what do you think? I mean, I know your answer to a lot of this, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. So, like I
Sure.
said, I'm a liberal, and so what's really important to me is a strong state that protects people's rights and a democratic, um, very similar to what you've articulated, a democratic will that also protects people's rights. And I think the state tends to be in history the best way to protect that, and so I'm generally pro-state as far as that goes. Um, but I've never been convinced by socialists because they tend to either want to completely eradicate the state, and I've always taken that as just a regression. I think you're just going to have less rights protected that way. In a very gradual process, I'm not against that, but that's too theoretical for me to just like say, oh yeah, absolutely. And the other objection that I have with socialists, or I have tended to have, is I guess the vulgar materialism, but even less vulgar forms of materialism and anti-capitalism, because I find it to be a little bit too. It just seems very based on feeling, and I've
Mhm.
never seen it demonstrated how we can do better. Like, what are we going to not do? Are we going to, if we get, because when we really get into the details, um, and you've even suggested that maybe we could have markets in a sense. I think.
Sure.
But when you really get into the details of with socialists, you can say, okay, so what are we going to do? Are we going to abolish markets? They say no, and then it's like, okay, well then you're a capitalist kind of, and I'm okay with adapting capitalism in a myriad of ways. I'm not so attached to the free market. I'm not like a neoliberal. We can't. That's just I don't buy into that at all. But I do think the basic capitalist toolbox is important, and so
Sure.
yeah. How do you deal with? I mean, yeah. Do you think what are the parts of capitalism that you strongly object to, and where are the parts where you say I'm not normatively against this, but I'd like to change it if possible to make life better for people. But if we can't, that's okay. Yeah. What are the most strong objections you have to capitalism? Yeah.
Sure. Uh, to have 5 hours. Okay, I'll try to keep it relatively brief by my standards, as I'm sure you're already noticing. Those could break gender standards, but I'll try. So let's just start with the state part, and then I'll move on to the capitalist part. Is that okay with you?
Yep.
Yeah. So the reason why I talk briefly about the state is I think that's another good reflection of just what we were talking about earlier about this kind of teleological vision of history. So Christine Sipnowich, in her really stellar book, The Concept of Socialist Law, points out that this idea that the state would wither away under socialism or communism owes less to Marx than to Engels, actually, who often insisted that once the mode of production was sufficiently developed, right, then there would be such a surplus of goods in society so that there be no longer any need for class antagonisms or class for that reason. And since class was the foundation of society and the state, um, because it was necessary in order to preserve, the class society, the state would wither away because there was no longer
Mhm.
any kind of functional historical need for it. And I think Sipnowich points out very accurately that we're always going to live under conditions of relative resource scarcity. We're never going to have so much of absolute everything that we're no longer going to have to engage in political discussions about how to distribute resources. Even in the most ideal socialist egalitarian society, we're still going to ask, are we going to dedicate this much time and this much resources to building hospitals that are open and available to everyone? Or are we going to allocate some of that to building, I don't know, universities and rocket ships and space stations that are available to everyone? Who knows, right?
Mhm.
And more importantly, as she points out, a lot of the kind of cultural, moral, and religious concerns are probably also not going to go away because in many circumstances, those answer not only moral issues that people have, or they speak to moral issues that people have, but existential issues that people have, right? And until people stop dying, or at least death and finitude are no longer of concern for us, something like White Noise by Don DeLillo, right? I'll take a pill and all those problems will just disappear, right? We're probably going to have to deal with the fact that there's going to be political conflicts over these things. And so she says it's very unlikely that the state is going to live our way, which is why socialists need to be a lot more willing to talk about what the concept of socialist law would look like, what differentiates socialist law from competing notions of law. And there she also argues for the importance of things like liberal rights, understood in a more socialist manner as embedded within society or emerging from society. And I think that's an appropriate step to take. So that's just on the first point. I don't think the state is going anywhere fast. And if it does, I'm not necessarily sure we'd like what would replace it. On the second point about critiques of capitalism, I have a lot of critiques of capitalism that I would make. One of the most foundational, of course, is just the way that capitalism restricts people's freedom, right? In various kinds of ways. There are so many instances of this that I don't want to get too much into it. Let's just talk about the workplace, right? Elizabeth Anderson, I think, points out very cogently in her book on private government that if you were to ask the average American, are you okay with the government telling you when to wake up in the morning, what clothes you're going to wear, when you can have lunch, when you can take a shit, right? All that kind of stuff. There'd be a revolution in seconds. People would be flying those snake flags, being like, "Don't tread on me, get the fuck away," live free or die, all that kind of stuff. And yet we are absolutely content with allowing all these practices to persist so long as they go on within the workplace, because employers are given wide discretion to tell their employees what to do uh, because of this very abstract notion of contract, right? And Marx himself was very aware of this, right? He points out in about the middle of Das Kapital, Volume 1, that liberals talk a big game about the importance of freedom of assembly, rights to freedom of expression, rights to suffrage, and I should point out he observes that that's all well and good, right? Reasons to commend that. But all that rhetoric falls silence the minute workers enter onto the factory floor, when all of a sudden all the good old despotism just reintroduces itself. And there's been a lot written about this recently, the ways that capitalism restricts freedom from a Marxist standpoint now, and I think very effectively. People like Vanessa Wills in Marx's Ethical Theory, which I'd recommend to people, or Bruno Leopold, his brilliant book Citizen Marx on Marx's Republicanism, I think really make the case that Marx was deeply concerned with emancipation in a very rich way. Uh, and I think that that's a concern that we constantly need to bring up again whenever people are trying to offer orthodox defenses of capitalism. Another respect in which I would be very critical of capitalism is in the ways that it constrains various kinds of social freedom or democratic agency. Uh, just to give you a couple examples of this, right? Martin Jones and Thomas Piketty in their 2012 and was it 2014? 2014, 2012, and 2020 books, Affluence and Influence and Capital and Ideology, both point out that it's very, very difficult to accurately characterize the United States as a democracy or even a republic of any meaningful sort, because both of those would imply that the people have at least some kind of say, ordinary people, in how their government operates. And they point out that empirically, it's just impossible to make that case, right? We can look at all the metrics, and by and large, political elites, regardless of party, tend to do whatever is in the best interests of the wealthiest Americans, whether or not that's what ordinary people also want. Indeed, often contrary to what ordinary people want. Right? Think about things like guaranteeing healthcare for all. Americans have wanted that for a very long time, and neither political party seems particularly keen to give that to them, right? And I think there are very obvious reasons for that. And this is not just a procedural issue, right? I think that social freedom and democratic agency is extremely important in being able to make power accountable to ordinary people. And the fact that we cannot make power accountable to ordinary people, because ordinary people are by and large powerless, is a very, very serious blemish on our society, and is reflective of the way that concentrations of economic power that are inevitable under capitalism will inevitably bleed into concentrations of political power that are extremely damaging and distorted. So that's another objection that I would make. And then the last objection that I'd make would probably be a moral cultural one. So this is drawn from Michael Sandel and Wendy Brown's great book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, and Sandel's book on the tyranny of meritocracy. So one of the things that Sandel and Brown point out is that, without a doubt, a certain kind of bourgeois ideology that stressed things like meritocracy and the elimination of the old aristocracy was an emancipatory ideological force, right? It broke down this idea that there are natural inequalities that are mapped by the feudal system, and consequently, we just all have to abide by this, and replaced it with this idea that we should have a dynamic, mobile society where even the poor have a chance to rise to the top. Undoubtedly progressive. But one of the things that Sandel points out is that every ruling class that has ever emerged in history, including the bourgeois class, or the very rich in our contemporary society, if you prefer, has always found mythological ways, and they really are mythological, of justifying its position. And ours is no different, right? Because the ruling class is very seldom content with just enjoying the spoils of its ill-gotten gains. They often want to feel that those spoils are deserved in some often very bizarre kind of way, right? That they're entitled to them, and consequently that the poor also belong where they are, right? And I think that the consequence of the kind of meritocratic, pseudo meritocratic, really, ethic that is so in, embedded in American cultural discourse is that for one of the first times in American and world history, we have a ruling class that truly feels that it has pulled itself up by its bootstraps and got to where it is by its own merits, and consequently owes nothing to anyone at the bottom. Right? They got where they are because they are the winners in a competition. And the inverse, of course, of that is that everyone else who doesn't make it to the top is made to feel, to put it in proper Trumpese, like they are losers, right? If you're homeless on the street, then you deserve Matt Walsh shitting on you day in and day out because you smell bad and he doesn't want his kids near you, and you deserve nothing but scorn and disdain. Well, we've seen the very, very negative implications and consequences of this kind of bizarre culture propagating itself over time, which is enormous amounts of polarization, enormous amounts of alienation, and millions, if not hundreds of millions, of very destitute people constantly being told by a couple of rich SOBs that if they are poor, that is where they deserve to be and they shouldn't ask for anything more. Right. And people are rightly getting quite angry at that, even if I don't think they're always channeling that anger in the right direction and certainly towards the right culprits. And I don't think that, but I don't think that this culture can stand for very much longer unless we undertake certain kinds of transformative reforms. Some very, very negative things could very well happen. Here, I'll just invoke Zizek, right? The most realistic thing that we could do right now is incorporate a bit of a utopian streak into our politics.
Yeah, I want to respond to each one of those actually, just to kind of make my positions clear and just to flesh them out a little bit more. So,
Sure.
on your first point about the workplace, I completely agree with you. I have no problem defending the workplace and saying it's actually democratic and that's great. I completely agree with you that ideally that is a restriction of freedom and we should not have restrictions of freedom. And I completely agree with you on every bit of that. The only problem I have is I've just never been convinced that there's an alternative.
Mm.
And it just seems like socialists just kind of say it's bad and then that's it. They're begging the question like, what? Okay, well, what is that? Wrong use of the term there, but whatever. So I just don't know what the solution to that is ultimately, because the way I look at it is that our current capitalist system has given us the most positive and most human flourishing so far, and I absolutely think we should reform that to make it even better. But just throwing it all out and just saying, well, there isn't democracy in the workplace, that just seems, I disagree with that. But having said that, like market socialists who say all we need is like co-ops, um, I'm like, okay, prove that that works, and then that's fine. I don't care. I mean, that's not anti-capitalist to me. That's like you're still engaging in a market, and you're still engaging in profits and all of that. All you're saying is that people can manage their own workplace. I'm not convinced that that's like going to work, but I don't really care either way. I'm not against it. Um, so, do you think there are answers as to how this is practical to actually make the workplace democratic? Do you think there are answers?
Sure.
Um, yeah,
I mean, look, I want to say first off, I completely agree with you that I think the left is historically been far better at offering critiques than offering alternatives that sound plausible. Um, and oftentimes when we do present alternatives, they don't look very attractive to the average American, right? Again, this is one of the problems I have with tanky discourse, right? Point out, look, sure, you can go to bat for Stalin and point out that people are misrepresenting what happened in the Soviet Union, and you can point out that in the 1950s, the Soviet Union enjoyed robust economic growth that was comparable to what you saw in the United States, and of course, they defeated the Nazis. But that discourse of you defending the Soviet Union and the other person critiquing it is never going to be one that's going to make the left look particularly good, right? Because you're
yeah,
still defending Stalinism, and for most people, quite rightly, again, Stalinism is bad, right? There needs to be a better alternative out there. And here I'm going to be very cliche, right? And say that I often point to the Nordic social democracies as ideals to, if not be emulated, at least serve as a jumping off point for experimenting with further kinds of anti-capitalist measures. Now, of course, there's a robust debate about how socialist the Scandinavian social democracies actually are, right? Some people say, they're not socialist at all. They're just market societies with very robust welfare states. Others, like the important Scandinavian historian Sejersted, point out that actually they did develop a unique kind of socialism, sometimes called the Scandinavian variant of socialism, that deserves to be appraised on its own merits and defects rather than lumped together with authoritarian forms of socialism, which is a view that I'm more sympathetic to. But here I think that the logician Scott Sahan, in his recent book, and his great book, people should read it, Socialism, A Logical Introduction, points out that this whole debate is really besides the point, right? It's very clear that the Scandinavian or Nordic social democracies are more socialist than the United States is right now by many metrics, right? And to your point about human flourishing, they're also more flourishing societies than the United States is right now, and have been so for, depending on when you want to count, 70 years, 100 years, right? So it's not clear how much longer we need to run this experiment and then to continue being successful, because so we think maybe they have a point. And Sahan's observation correctly is let's incorporate some of those kind of socialist features into the United States. Now, you point out co-ops. Like a lot of people, I'm very sympathetic to that, right? Uh, and I would also want to accompany this with widespread redistributive efforts, the implementation of things like universal healthcare, universal post-secondary education, without a doubt, universal childcare and MAC care, et cetera, on the advanced edge of what you found in Nordic social democracies, many of which, again, were very successful programs, right, by any metric you adjudicate them. But on the more radical edge, I would propose implementing something like the Meidner scheme that was proposed by Swedish Social Democrats in the 1970s under Olof Palme, pioneered by the important socialist economy Meidner, where he suggested, look, if we really want worker ownership of the means of production, one of the ways that we can do that is for bigger firms, just gradually have the trade unions that operate in those firms receive stock in the shares, stock in the companies that they work in. And this will go on for several years. And after about 10 years, the trade unions will essentially be the majority shareholders in their company. Bada bing, bada boom, we've peacefully transferred the means of production into the workers' hands, right? And it's worth noting that, Swedish capital was very comfortable with quite radical redistributive efforts, but this was a bridge too far even for them. And they launched a very well-funded campaign to try to stop the Social Democrats and Minder from implementing the scheme. Eventually, they got a version of it through, but it was far less ambitious, right? I think that that is something that is very worth experimenting with now, especially in bigger companies like, let's just be mean for a second, Tesla, right? Or let's say the Trump administration or the Trump organization and its company, its subsidiary companies also, right? Because again, there's nothing military, there's nothing violent or expropriative about it, in the sense that workers burn down, guillotine the capitalists and take over the companies. They just receive stock in the companies year in and year out, become majority shareholders, and now they control the companies. I think that that's the right way to go moving forward.
Right. And then in terms of money in politics, I mean, I think it's undeniable that money has an influence in politics, but I think where it gets complicated is two questions. One is that money probably should have an influence in politics in a way,
Sure.
and then the second problem I think is that often I think people attribute money a lot more power than it deserves. So
Sure.
on the first point, I think companies should be able to, because they're representing such like large amounts of people, I think they should be able to advocate for things that are within their industry. I just think that's how this should work. Now, they shouldn't be able to overrule the popular will, but they should have like a say. They should have a voice. They should be able to be one of the many factions and groups of people who have a voice, I think. And I think it's hard to argue against that unless we've gotten rid of the capitalist mode of production, I suppose. Then you could argue against that. But it seems like it's hard to argue against that in the meantime. And in terms of how people overstate the case, I think most political issues are are decided democratically. I mean, you bring up uh, maybe you have seen different information than I have, and I'd like to see if you have. But it seems to me that Medicare for all or universal health care or whatever is actually not supported by the majority of people. If you talk to the average American about it, they're like, I don't want long lines and I don't want the government to be involved, and they're very uncomfortable with universal health care. And it seems like there's a very strong sentiment, a strong democratic sentiment against that. Um, so I guess I mean I'd like to say that that's the case for a lot of issues, but specifically on that issue, I guess those two issues. Um, yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think I'm wrong about assessing the political viability of that, the democratic viability, and do you disagree that corporations should have some say? Those 2 points, yeah.
Well, I'll start with the Medicare for all one, right? I think that if you look at recent polls, most Americans say that the government has a obligation to ensure that everyone has access to basic medical services. And more negatively, polls repeatedly show that Americans, by and large, have an exceptionally negative appraisal of the healthcare system as it currently exists, right? Or even just today, right? I think at its peak, only about 15% of voters in red counties, right, Republican counties, justify or are behind cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, right, like what the Trump administration wants to bring up. So I think that presents a pretty compelling Democratic case for reforming the system. Now, you are absolutely right that if you say, do you want socialized medicine or do you want state-funded healthcare systems? Then people's attitudes very quickly change. Although part of that is also just a terminological switch, right? And
Sure.
I think this is where socialists and for that matter, left liberals, need to try to make the case that healthcare in the system has deliberately been broken, and that there is not just alternatives out there, but far better functioning alternatives that many other comparable states have implemented for a long period of time. Right. So just to give one example, there was a study done by the Commonwealth. Sorry, what's the name of it? I can't remember the name of the think tank. Anyway, um, the think tank ranked the American healthcare system as about 70th or 71st in the world,
Hmm.
right behind Algeria and Armenia. Right, almost every developed state was ranked as having a better healthcare system than the United States, and even Mexico was creeping up on the United States. Right, the Gaddam Fund. Sorry, that's the one. Right, the Gaddam Foundation. Excuse me. Uh, and the big reason that the United States was ranked as having basically a healthcare system that's comparable to the developing world was access, right? Yeah, if you're extremely wealthy, you'll be able to get entry into the Mayo Clinic and you'll have the best healthcare in the world. But that's kind of like saying, well, a luxury sedan or a limousine is the best vehicle in the world. And so we should give a lot of credit to the kind of society that produces a lot of limousines. Maybe, yeah, it's a nice vehicle to have, but 99% of the people aren't going to be able to get it, right?
Right.
So what difference does it really make? By contrast, there are many different public healthcare models out there in almost every other developed state, all of which have far better outcomes. And also, I should add, are far cheaper and far less bureaucratic, right? I've lived in the United States now for only about 2 years. I come from Canada, which, to be clear, has a radically underfunded health system, still ranked far higher, I should add, than what we have in the United States. And I can tell you, there is no comparing the amount of bureaucracy that I have to deal with in Canada to the sheer volume of bureaucracy I have to deal with week in and week out here, right? And I always find it surprising that Americans who claim to despise bureaucracy and red tape constantly seem so determined to defend the system when it is the most convoluted thing that I have ever encountered, right? In Canada, if I want to go to the doctor, I go, I give them my health card, I sign in, that's it, right? I
Mm-hmm.
don't ever get multiple calls and emails from my health insurance providers asking, do you really need this care? Did you get it from your primary service provider? Did you go to the right hospital? Right? Well,
Yeah.
if you do go to the hospital, make sure you go to the one on this block and not that block because the one on that block isn't part of our network, so be cautious about that, right?
Yeah.
If anything, every time I encounter this, I kind of think to myself that this kind of Frankensteinian creation in the United States looks like something a clown would create. That's how laughable it is. And the tragic dimension of this kind of clownish attitude is that so many very affluent people will do everything that they can to defend it, knowing that it is a terrible system for ordinary people. And I think the average American citizen deserves a lot better than what they have right now, and it is long past time that they get it. Now, in terms of the influence of money in politics, look, I'm realistic enough to say that money is always going to be involved in politics, right? I don't think that we're ever going to enter into some kind of platonic utopia where, every person is going to be a philosopher king. So maybe there's a democratic aspect to this Platonism, and they're just going to rationally discourse with one another about politics. And
Mm-hmm.
invariably, the person who has the best argument will win because everyone else will say it is verily so, right? So I concede the point to you, and let's just do what is most rational, right? Human nature being what it is. The crooked from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight will ever be made, and money and power are always going to influence our political intimations. But I do think that it is very obvious that we need money to have much less of an impact than it does in contemporary American politics on both parties, right? And this is where I somewhat agree with you, right? So let's take Citizens United as a touchstone, right? Many people expected that the Republican Party was going to be the chief beneficiary of Citizens United, which allowed corporations to spend large amounts of money when electioneering, right? And in some respects, they have, right? There's a reason that Republicans tend to be pretty adamant in defending Citizens United. But in the last election, Hillary Clinton, or sorry, conflating my Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris received more money than Donald Trump, right? So the Democrats were actually the beneficiary of a lot of these kind of dark money donations, right?
Right.
But my response to that isn't, well, it doesn't really make a difference in the end. My response to that is Jillian's point, which is this goes to show you why, which regardless of which party goes into power, winds up in power, the ones who always win are capitalists and big money. And what we need to do in order to prevent that is to make sure that they have less of an influence on both major parties, and ideally actually create a more democratic system where there can be a plurality of parties out there, which will be less subject to being co-opted by the influence of big money.
Right. Okay. I mean, those are fair objections. I mean, there's more to get to here, but we're hitting the 2 hour mark. So yeah, I really appreciate you. I really appreciate that we talked. I mean, we covered a decent bit of ground here. Hopefully, some of your positions on the fundamental questions and some of the specifics also is more clear and where you stand
Thank
versus
you.
other Marxists. Yeah. So I really appreciate you coming on a lot. Um, and yeah, thank you everyone for watching. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.